All right, folks, you know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Reid, Blusterini in the home game, and at Rec Poker Jim on the hellscape we call Twitter. And I have the best freaking job in the world talking poker with my friends here on the Strategy Forums edition of the podcast every Monday night while we steal each other's chips in the free nightly home game. Now, I have to mention we're brought to you by Running Aces, the official sponsor of the Rec Poker Podcast. They're located less than an hour north of the Twin Cities in the beautiful state of Minnesota, and you can find out more about them at runaces.com. Most of what we do here is free. We're a largely volunteer-based organization here at Rec Poker, so we really depend on the support of our sponsors and our premium members who jump in and get involved in our training material and study opportunities for only $22 a month. Now, you can always sign up for free. We have a great wealth of resources available for all recreational poker players of all skill levels. But if you want to take your game to the next level, you really do recommend you join our premium membership for $22 a month. And remember, you can always get your first month for only $5 by using the code RecPoker at checkout. And if even $5 is a lot, trust me, I understand. Especially these days, it's kind of hard to make ends meet to put things together. So you don't even need $5 to become a premium member here at Rec Poker. If you make a donation to your local food bank for any amount, even just $1, we'll make sure to credit you a free month of premium membership here at Rec Poker for helping out your neighbors. And I encourage you to do that. So please do and get more involved. Now, you hear me and my voice a lot because they let me host the show on Mondays, but I'm only one man. It takes a group, a gang, a crew to make all the magic happen around here. We call this group of wizards the RECing Crew. If you want to find out more about me or the rest of the crew, go to rec.poker/crew, or you can just listen up because you can meet a few of them right here tonight on the show, starting with our own producing co-host, Chris Jones.
Well, I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the PokerStars home game, and I help run our monthly strategy segment called The Deep Dive.
And I'm Mark Zhang. On RecPoker, you can find me under Mr. Bullet. Once a month, every first Thursday of the month, I'll host a study group session where we talk about tournaments and strategies.
That's right, folks. So yeah, come check it out. You can work with Chris and Mark and other fantastic members of the RECing Crew, and I hope you do come get more involved. So this is the forums edition of the show, where we typically will take a hand or a spot that we've recently played, or a hand from the Rec Poker forums or from our Discord channel. And I would encourage our listeners, we've really amped up our efforts over on Discord. There's a lot of fantastic free resources for folks. If you go to rec.poker/Discord, you can find an invitation there too, not just for premium members, but a lot of great free stuff as well. This is a hand where I'm laughing because we just can't get enough of this hand. Several weeks ago, we did an episode with Mark and Taylor Moss and Kim Kilroy and I think Rob Washam, talking about a hand that Taylor played in the WSOP earlier this summer. And it sparked a lot of controversy and comments and feedback on social media and in our forums and Discord and stuff. And so we wanted to continue that conversation. So last week, we went even deeper into the hand with Chris and Kim and John Somsky with our YouTube group, and got some really good feedback, some really good questions. And we just didn't feel like we really tied a bow on it perfectly. So we're back, folks. We're back. We're talking again about Taylor Moss's King Queen hand from the WSOP earlier this year. We got the big guns in the house. It's Chris Jones and Mark Zhang. And just while we were kind of joking about how we cannot get to the bottom of this hand and sort of how to play some of these tough spots out of position post flop, Mark said, yeah, well, I was listening along on your conversation, and yeah, you guys still got some splaining to do. So let's open this up. So just to kind of frame the conversation, we're talking about situations where we are the pre-flop aggressor, pre-flop, we get post-flop, we're out of position, and we basically have to decide on what streets are, assuming we're not just going to fire 3 streets, on what streets are we going to give up, check. And what does it tell our opponents about our hand range when we do so? And how can we prevent our opponents from kind of taking advantage of us when we demonstrate the strength of our hand through our betting patterns? So, Chris, maybe you can kind of take what I said and make it sound more accurate or better to the actual conversation. But you were the one that sort of had this framing in mind. That's essentially what we're getting at here.
Well, and I think it was sparked in some of the conversation. Some of the stuff I've been thinking about is like, how do I not just totally expose the strength of my hand through my actions, particularly when I'm out of position? And I think before we started this episode, Mark was talking about a few ways in which, as the in position player in this scenario, kinds of boards that you might be able to attack for just this kind of reason, because and we can talk about this when he was discussing a monotone flop, where then there's a fourth of the suit that comes up, and like the opportunities that gives you to find bluffs that nobody thinks you can possibly have. And I guess the question, so that I want to have that conversation because I thought that was a fascinating one that we had off air. But um, I think that the starting framework of this is, how do we find hands that are in that middle part of our range that have some value that we would like to see get to showdown, but that aren't maybe strong enough to bet three streets, especially in a three bet pot, which we're probably having to go for stacks at that point. Um, how do we play those kinds of hands when we've got on this king seven deuce board that we've been looking at for a while, when we've got queens and jacks and tens that we three bet pre-flop, where we got called, we saw the king on the flop, and maybe we shouldn't have bet him. Maybe one of the things we talked about last week was maybe we shouldn't have bet that to begin with on the flop. Maybe those are the kinds of hands that we want to sort of skip a street earlier on in the hand to protect ourselves. And maybe the turn isn't the spot where we want to have this, but I'd be curious about sort of, Mark, maybe your thoughts just on that hand in general, and then I want to get to the conversation about
Okay.
the monotone
So
one we were talking about too.
a lot to unpack. Let's take the King 70s rainbow, right?
Yeah, rainbow,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, in a three bet pot from the big blind. I think if we're really deep, like he was in that hand, right? So if I had to construct a certain, like you can actually construct strategies. You can bet big, you can bet a quarter. If you can bet a quarter, you can bet more hands. If you can bet big, you can't bet as many hands. So if I give myself the option of betting big and check, like the first hand that comes into mind would be like ace king type of hands. And if I had to find a check, it would probably be with queens, because like rather queens than tens or nines, because nines and tens they need more protection, where queens don't really need any protection, like because the king is already there. I think a lot of thing that people don't think about is the moment you bet, you're strengthening your villain's range. Because if you bet, let's say on king seven deuce, if he has 4-5, he's gonna fold. But tens has like 90, or queens has like 92% equity against this hand. So at the moment, when you bet, you're forcing him to fold out 10% of like equity, like that has nothing against you. And that's when they build a pot with a marginal hand out of position, and they're strengthening the villain's range. So now you're making it tougher on you, right? Where you can actually check with queens, and you still have like, I think 80% or 70% pot share. But the moment you bet and you bet and you bet, like at some point you get to a point where like his range is so strong that obviously every time you bet twice, he calls and he gets there to the river, he has a king, no surprise, right? But when you check, like he doesn't have a king every time, and that's what people don't understand. Like they just see the king and they freak out. So when we go back and we decide about a small bet or a check, if we go for a small bet, we can bet a lot, we can bet, But still, if we bet a lot, I would still rather bet tens and nines than queens because queens don't
Hmm.
need protection. If like another thing to transition into the turn, it has to do with your preflop range because your preflop range is lacking the let's say we three bet for the big blind and flop comes like a 10-9-7 board. It's not it's not that like usually when we have ace king or kings we are like it kind of sucks because the moment we bet the range gets stronger and we are facing pairs and gut shots and split draws, but he's supposed to have pocket fives. If we check, he's gonna check pocket fives probably. Or at least we have over 90% against pocket fives. So it has to do also with your pre-flop range construction where you are supposed to three bet some 10-9 suited and jack 10 suited just to have that board coverage. So you can feel comfortable folding your ace king by the turn or by the on the flop because you have other hands to continue with, and that's the main issue with your pre-flop. In poker, a lot of things start pre-flop.
There was a couple things that jumped out at me. So like first of all, in last week's episode, we were talking about like this King 7-2 board, and I was wrong. I called that a high frequency C bet spot, and people in the YouTube chat were like, no, that's actually a low frequency C bet spot. And Chris and Mark are saying the same thing there.
But no, I said when it's a single race pot, it would be, but in a three bet pot, you can craft two different strategies. And it's okay to have
Yes.
two different strategies. If you enter it into the solver, you can tell the solver, oh, take the only thing you're allowed to do is bet pot. It will construct a strategy to bet pot or to bet
Sure.
10%. Everything is possible. You just have to like align your proper combo into the right bucket.
Yeah, no, that's well put.
Yeah.
And the one of the things that I really took away from Mark's point earlier is that, when you're c betting and your opponent is calling, they're eliminating a lot of the error from their range that, as he says, they're folding. But your range still has a lot of error because you're still c betting with some of your bluffs and your semi bluffs. And so as you get further into the hand where you're continuing your aggression from previous streets, you're actually going to have a much weaker range. And your opponent's actually like folding out a lot of their worst hands already. So you're coming up against a stronger range there already, which is intuitive but not obvious. So I wanted to just reinforce that notion.
Also one more thing, like I heard in the previous conversation, people were talking about, oh, if we check our turn, we have to check our river, right? And that's a false statement because to play a balanced strategy, you're supposed to have some check call on the turns that actually check fold on the river, because
Hmm.
otherwise you're exploitable because they know you're the bad player, the fish that never folds. Because if you call the turn, they can bet whatever on the river, and you're supposed to have some check call, check folds because that's how you're cleaning up your range, like on each street against every bet.
Yeah, I like that. That's good.
Mark, one of the questions that we had last week that I'd love to get your perspective on is what do we do with our absolute value um, on um, on in this kind of situation? We're in the blind, we've three bet, been called, flop comes king seven deuce. We have C bet, and then the turn is a nine. And let's say we've got king nine. We three bet some king nine suited. We've got some pocket nines, maybe pocket sevens. We've got some pocket kings. And if we need to be able to sometimes check hands like queens, um, and if we have a really thinking player or opponent against us, we have to do something to sort of slow them down from just blowing us
Right.
off our entire range. So, how do we think about what part of our really strong value that
Okay.
we find a check on this turn with that part of our range?
Um, so I let's say the turn would be a nine, right?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, obviously, I think everyone agrees with checking pocket kings because there's not much merit to it. We block the continuing range, and pocket kings actually benefit from him rivering a set or rivering an ace. And also, what a lot of people do wrong is if the ace hits, they would start betting again. But it's actually vice versa because now we have to, if you think about the river when you have queens and the ace hits, you're not betting queens, right?
Hmm.
So kings is trying to replicate queens where they actually go for the check raise because you unblock their betting range on the river because they will get to the river with some ace queens, ace jacks. So you can actually get an additional bet in with pocket kings. And what most people do wrong is they just bet themselves,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, Now going back to the turn, if I had to protect pocket queens, I would three bet a hand like king 10 offsuit or king 10 suited and then check the turn because if I get to the turn, I take my weakest kings as a check because they don't get as much value from better kings. So if I have ace king or king queen, they get value. But king 10 now, like I could be value cutting myself. So the moment king 10 bets again, you're facing that stronger range where if you check, you can let him bluff.
Hmm.
Some hands where like you can even check king 10 on king 7 deuce on the flop and then um you can mix in a check with queens like you can like you just have to be aware that a, a top pair with a weaker kicker does not have as much value as you think it has.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
there's no protection needed because there's nothing to protect against.
Hmm.
Because the moment you bet, the range is stronger, and then like you don't know where you're at on the river. Are you ahead? Are you
Right,
behind?
right,
Does he have
right,
a better
right,
hand? Does he not have a better hand?
right.
So it's better to actually keep the bottom part that has zero equity or 10 or 5 to 10% equity against your king 10 to keep those hands in.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because then you're forcing your opponent to deal with it. Let's say
Yes.
king 7 deuce, you check, he has threes. He checks, and then comes a 9. You check. What is he going to do with threes? At some point, people will put in stabs. And if you bet, you don't put him in that spot. He already folded.
Right,
But
right.
if you check, you're actually forcing him to continue that wide range that has 0% equity against the hand.
Hmm.
And that's what people like are negligible about.
Hmm.
So I think part of the question, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, is like, especially for recreational players, we just don't want to be in these positions where taking the check call line as a bluff catcher is the correct branch of the decision tree because it makes us uncomfortable. We're guessing. We don't know how to use like blockers properly to know when to call and when not to call. So I wonder if like maybe it's an impossible question because it's almost like Chris is asking like how can we avoid putting ourselves in the position of having to play bluff catchers out of position?
Mhm.
And like the more we talk about it, the more I'm like, fold out of position, free flop. Like, are there ways that we can just avoid having to be in this uncomfortable position, or is it just part of playing out of position that you have to be in this
Okay.
kind of bluff catcher lines?
So I think it's a human notion that like we don't want to be wrong. Like we
You
don't want
right.
to check call and be wrong. We don't want him to river a three and like hit a set and like, I shouldn't have let him get there. But that's the wrong way to think about it. It's just not how poker works. Like if you play poker, you have to be okay. You will be wrong. You're supposed to punt. You're supposed to like do some crazy shit that makes no sense because that's just how poker like what I see when I play live poker or like against a lot of recreationals, they just want to win money or like they care about winning money or chips or whatever. But that's not how poker works. Poker is an odds game. Sometimes you will lose, sometimes he will get there. It's a game of odds. Like sometimes some things are going to happen and you can't influence that. The only thing you can influence is actually the EV you gain or lose by forcing him to bet threes.
Mm,
That's
Right.
actually where you get what you with that particular combo. If the turn is a 9, I forced him to put in checker threes.
mm.
That's the only way you actually gain massive value because you're a massive favorite when he puts in money with threes. But you're not a massive favorite once you bet big and then you have to check call. Then he's not gonna show you threes.
Right, right. Yeah, I love what you're saying there about how uh we're kind of like bringing our opponent to, and I wonder if you can talk about this from the perspective, like we were having this conversation, and I think it's sort of related to like how you have to do, like as you put it, some crazy shit sometimes because people aren't sort of like they're not behaving in a way, or they're not understanding the game of odds. And so maybe you can talk about, set the stage and talk about that sort of that monotone hand you were talking about, and how you approach that versus how you think most of the population does.
Um, okay, well, this monotone board isn't like something crazy. It's just math. But I have a few hands that are actually like crazy, and I'm not sure if it's actually too much for people. Like, um, which one would you like to hear? The monotone board?
Well, let's start there because
Yeah.
that was really intriguing to me.
Okay, so let's take a middle position or early position like raise and the big blind defense, and the flop comes 9-5 deuce or hearts, and we go for standard c-bet, big blind calls. The turn is a 9 of spade, and he checks, and we bet half pot again. He calls, and the river is a queen of hearts, and he checks, and I bet pot. This is a spot where all my bluffs would get there because if I'm barreling, I have like nut flush draw, the second nut flush draw. So a lot of people, they would actually just think, oh, it's only this hand that he can have. But a really good player, he can actually find bluffs in that particular instance because he knows you think that he never bluffs. Like, what does he have? Because he has to start barreling the flop with some sort of hand that has equity, but does not contain a heart. And it's a very unintuitive hand class that we pick because if we get to the river with some sort of two pair, like a king queen or a king nine or a queen nine, we don't have a reason to bluff because two pair or one pair has showdown value. So it has to be an unpaired hand that doesn't have a heart, that doesn't have a pair. Because if we think about the big blind's folding range, it's mostly going to be pairs. So we do not want to interact with the pairs that are on board or the sets that are on board. Also, what a lot of people do is they start check raising a set or flush on the flop because they want to get value. So once we go half pot on the turn and they still don't check raise us, I exploit the fact that they have nothing to call down with on the river except like 9, 8 high flushes or 10 high flushes. But if my perceived range is just better flushes, that's how I win money. In poker, you win money by taking a line that people think it's underbluffed and you just bluff crazy because then you just print. It's like when like a couple years ago, when you 3-bet and the flop is ace, king, deuce, you just bet everything because it's just impossible to continue. It's sort of the same concept.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Now, here's the question: what do you think are the bluffs? Like
that's my question. Because now you have to be even on the flop. You have to be planning for these runouts, right? Where
so the first, what was it, 9-5 deuce? Was that the board?
Yeah, 9-5 deuce.
So it's got to be something like 8-7, 6-7. Some of those kinds of like gutters without a heart that don't get there.
like you could also do like Queen Jack or something that's got two overs in the back door.
I gotcha.
Oh, you go. Oh, yeah, it was a pair on the river. Right. Yeah. That's not going to work.
Jack
Yeah.
10. Wait, no, Jack
Jack
10.
10 is a straight.
Oh, Jack 10's a
Yeah,
straight.
Jack 10's a
Yeah,
straight.
so no,
Yeah.
it's gotta be these like 8-7, 8-6,
Okay.
4-3, some of
Okay.
those.
It's gonna be King Jack because it was
Mm.
the river was a queen, right? Or King Jack of spade, like that would be a hand. Or like an ace three of spade.
Mm,
Ah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It has to be like those something like those combos. But what a lot of people do is they check the turn with ace three of spade, and then
Right.
when the moment they check, their river betting range is so unbalanced that it's just not flushes.
Yeah, because we're going to be betting monotone flops in position at a high frequency, right? Like we're going to be stabbing with a ton of those
Well,
on the flop. And the question is like continuing on the turn with a lot of those non-intuitive ones. Is
yes.
that right?
And
Yeah.
it's a lot of unintuitive bluffs that people just don't find.
mm, mm.
Right. Yes. 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 And that's the spot that Chris is talking about, like continuing. So now someone's called and they've done it in a spot like, on a monotone board. It's like, do they have a very high heart? Do they have, like a strong made hand already? Because those are really the only two kinds of hands that are going to be calling there. So the turn is when it's a great example because when Chris is kind of like talking about how do we maintain the ability to fire on the river and have it all make sense the whole time along. And so you have to do that by continuing.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that fair, Chris? So that doesn't get at the question of sort of like how do we keep our checking range from being um exploited because we've I guess we've changed the question in that case. I can see your
Well, it does sort of speak to it a bit in that second barrel that we find on the 9-5 deuce heart board, and it was a queen on the turn, right? So it's a 9-5 deuce
Yeah.
heart with a queen on the turn. Like when we find a second barrel there, if we don't have a heart, like a lot of people are not going to find that second barrel. And this is, I think, similar to what I'm talking about or
yeah.
asking the question about is how do we keep our options open in some ways so that we can represent strength in these situations? And should we sometimes be betting some of these marginal hands so that our options are open, so that we have the possibility of representing nutted hands on the river, even if we don't have them?
Was
And
that a question?
yeah,
Yeah,
so
I guess it is a question. I mean, it's a theory slash question that I'm trying to wrestle with.
and it sounds like what Mark's answer, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like Mark's answer has to do with just changing the content of the betting versus the checking range so that the betting range actually has more low equity hands that unblock your opponent's folds on future streets, and you are checking with more of those kind of medium strength hands.
Right, right,
So
Yeah, like
that
a medium hand would be like an ace nine on the turn.
right.
Like that's an
right,
example. You're not supposed to barrel everything through. Like you actually
right.
with like how poker is made is you get you start early position with this range, you start MP with this range. So based on the different runouts, you will have some good hands in each line. Let's say that it goes check check on the turn. You have ace nine. The check on the turn is not because you're scared, but it's to force him to bluff the seven sixes, or
Mhm.
like just to ma make him bluff some hands. And if you had like ace king of spade, you're not really supposed to bet again because this hand, ace king of spade, has enough showdown to just show it down. And your ace nine is covering up for the ace king. It's making up for the check of the ace king. Of course, you can continue betting ace king, but you're not accomplishing great things. But like if we want to look for bluffs when the heart runs out, I guess we can pick ace king. Like it's not horrible. But what also what makes good poker, like yeah, good poker is, let's say the river is now the 4. Now ace 3 gets there.
Right.
Now we can't bluff ace 3 of spade anymore. Let's say it's a 4 of hearts. Now we cannot bluff ace 3, and we cannot bluff like we all our hearts get there. So now we have to find the bluff from a different part of our range. What if the river is an ace? Now our ace 3 gets there. What are we gonna bluff then? Like there are so many like runners you have to think about, and you have to start on the flop or strategize on the flop already. And that's what most people don't get, because by the turn they are unbalanced. All they know is their c-bet of 1.5 big blinds, and then they just freestyle from that. Like what happens on the turn is the moment you don't barrel your ace 3 of spade, you remove a lot of the natural bluffs when you triple barrel when the heart comes. So I'm always folding when the heart comes, because I know people have to bluff the flop and the turn to eventually get to the river with enough bluffs, and people don't.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I actually just barrel everything. So I have enough, but then it means that on a certain run out, you cannot bluff certain hands because you're already bluffing on the flop on the turn. So you have to give up on some bluffs on the river, depending on the run out. That's actually how proper poker is being played. Here's a really interesting thing. Like when we all learn about poker, we learn about the different hand strength, right? Like one pair beats two pair, and everyone knows it because it's on the sheet. But you don't get the sheet of what's the correct bluff. Like where do we start the bluff? Like what's the worst bluff? What's the best bluff? You don't have that. Like nobody learns that.
Right.
Yeah, and I like the way that you're talking about this, Mark, because when you say like, so we could bluff with ace king here, but when you look at all the hands in the range, we can reach our frequency of bluffing that we want to reach by actually just using better candidates than that. Hands that have less showdown value than ace king, or that block or unblock certain things. It's like finding the perfect pieces for the puzzle that we're building.
Yeah,
you can just jam some pieces in there and it might look okay, and it'll still be the same number of pieces in the puzzle. But to find the ones where you optimize the value of your entire range, right? So then you're playing ace king in the way that's most profitable. You're playing 9-10 suited in the way that's most profitable. You're playing 4-5, suited in the way that's most profitable. You can take profitable lines with any of these hands, but when you're trying to see how can I play the entire range together, the full, strategy of poker, you have to put each one of those, and it's like, where do you get the most out of that combo or that iteration of it? So
yeah, if we go back about the king 7 deuce, like pocket queens doesn't achieve a purpose, king 10 doesn't achieve a purpose. Like when we check top set and the river is an ace and we bet, it doesn't achieve the best purpose or the max purpose. Right. It's like, what's the purpose of my hand?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, what they end up doing is they just end up they love protecting, because they hate when you get there, when villain gets there. Like I remember, like you were saying in the last podcast about you don't want the villain to call with the flush draw.
Oh yeah, sizing. We were talking about sizing
And to be honest, if you're deep and he has a flush draw, there's no amount you can bet because that makes him fold, because he is entitled to a certain fraction of the pot share, and you have to bet really big to get him to fold. But then you're sort of making a mistake against his top range.
Right.
So what people are not understanding is they are focusing on that flush draw. Okay, but they're not focusing on pocket threes, on pocket fours.
Right.
That's what I care about. Like how would I get more than if the roles were reversed? Like, how would I get more out of it? You get the same amount of ace kings as me, as Chris Jones. You get more aces than me, but whatever.
Yeah, that's true. I definitely do. Yeah.
But everyone gets the same amount like distribution-wise overall in general. And it's the way we play every category or combo of each hand to the best of our abilities that makes the difference. And that's why you see Adamo and everyone else on the top, because they just find the right combo in each line.
So let me ask, when you're seeing a board like King 7 deuce or this 9-5 deuce rain, or all heart board. So one of the exercises, what I just heard you say, which I think is a really interesting one, and one that I think I kind of do, but not to the level you're doing. You're literally thinking about when this kind of card comes, this kind of hand turns into a bluff. But if
Yes.
this kind of card comes, this kind of hand just gets folded, or
Yes.
this kind of card comes, now this hand is actually a value hand, and I can do XYZ with
exactly.
it. So like you're thinking about, okay, I'm on the flop here. What are all the possible turn cards that are coming, and what does it do to both my range and my hand?
Right.
Ultimately, right?
Yes. And the exploited, that's GTO, right? But the exploitative part is, at what point is he deviating so I can overbluff or underbluff or overvalue? Like sometimes I'm not supposed to play a certain line, but I know that he is unbalanced by the sizing he bet the turn. And then I can just take advantage of it. That's the exploitative part. But it's to know what is the baseline. So at what point he's actually walking around the baseline and trying to make it easier for him. Like a lot of people, they love betting the turn so they can check the river.
Right.
Like everyone has done it. And I love when I see that bet. It's the best.
Talk a little more about that, Mark, because I think that is a very common, and we even talked about it last week about how, like, depending on how draw heavy the board is, like a lot of people will take that line because they can like get value on the turn. Maybe they can't get it on the river.
A very easy exploit is like they bet the turn because it's some sort of like weird marginal like hand that doesn't want to bet too big but get some value, right? Well, I'm all in. What do you do? What are you gonna do now?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's a stupid adjustment, but what are you gonna do about it?
Yeah.
This is exactly what I'm trying to prevent too.
Exactly.
To go back to the King 7 deuce hand. Like this is exactly when I check the turn here. This is exactly what I'm trying to prevent. Is like the bet on the turn. I call the turn on bet, and then I just blasted it away on the river.
And if your hand, basically, when you're in position and you have like a medium hand that wants to bet for protection and to not call the river, if you can't really bet, it's not a bet. It's supposed to be a check. And people just like to make their life easy by betting. And even when me saying that, people are still going to do it. And that's what the best part of poker is, because like, unless people learn that they need to check and bluff catch river because of that 10% of my range that are going to fold anyways if you bet. Now you're opening up the opportunity for me to bluff raise you, to call on the turn and then donk on the river. And now you wanted to check. Well, now you don't get to check anymore. Right? And now I value own you because you wanted to check.
And I think you really nailed it there, Mark. Like, I think a lot of recreational players in particular want to avoid tough decisions. And so they'll take a non-optimal line on a previous street to just sort of like have an easier decision to make. It's like, oh, I'll just bet small and fold to a raise. And like, okay, but what if you're playing against someone who understands how to read the strength of that? And this is what Chris has been getting into with this whole question, is like, how do we avoid putting ourselves in positions where opponents can pile on when we've demonstrated, that we don't have the nuts? But like, I don't think we can, Chris. Like, maybe it's just one of those things.
I mean, a good opponent, no. Like, against most people, and that's why the protection betting works, because against 89 or 90% of people, they don't do anything about it.
Right.
They just let you have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, until
Yeah.
you face like someone that's competent, and he just says, I'm all in. And
Right.
Yeah.
then or he
Yeah.
calls the turn and then donks pot on the river
Right.
for value because he wanted to check.
Right. Right. Right.
So Mark, to hear you say it, and I really enjoy this conversation. So we came into this conversation last week, sort of like, how can we avoid being put in this difficult position of having to bluff catch? And this is putting it in a very small box, but like this is
Yeah,
one of the things. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, hey, dummies, you don't want to avoid that. That's actually a very profitable situation to be in, compared to the other options available to you. And you can't really avoid being in bluff catching spots. All you can do is try and create a situation where you're bluff catching against as weak ranges as possible. And you can kind of control that a little bit with your own bet sizing, I suppose.
I
A
think
little.
it comes down like in one word, like better range construction.
Yeah.
Like just knowing what goes into what.
Mm-hmm.
And like again, like people humans they hate being wrong and letting him get there. But it's just part of the game. Like there's
Mm.
nothing to protect against the flush draw. Like the
Right.
flush draw is gonna draw no matter how much you bet. But because you have to think about it, if the roles are reversed, you're gonna chase the flush draw the same way. So
Hmm.
who's really gaining EV in the long run?
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody.
Right.
But who's gaining EV when I force you to bluff pocket threes, maybe? Now
Right.
I'm gaining EV, right? That's
Right.
how like actual poker works.
Yeah. And by taking the other line, we're kind of letting people off the hook with that part of their range that they would choose to put chips in, as a bluff afterwards. So
Yes.
last oh yeah, no, please
And
continue.
it's okay. Again, it's okay to fold. Like you're
Right.
Right.
supposed to fold sometimes. You're supposed to fold queens, and that's just part of the game. You will get bluffed in the game. Like it's not the goal is not to not get bluffed. The goal is just to try to find the best decision with your hand or to make the EV.
We've put a lot of pretty sophisticated stuff into our audience's ears, over this episode. Let's leave them with one, kind of easier to apply, thought. So let's say, all right, so we're gonna listen to Mark, we're gonna create these situations, we're going to intentionally check, planning to call some bluffs from these aggressive players. Mark, and Chris, of course, uh, what kind of, we talk about like unblocking the bluffs that our opponents have. Like, how should our listeners who aren't really used to thinking about bluff catching strategically, what should they look for when it's a good time to bluff catch? What do they have in their hand, or what do they have that's public information from the hand that would steer them towards bluff catching or away from bluff catching? Let's make bluff catching a little less frightening, for our audience. It's just
Um,
like an example of where we're like blocking their value hands and unblocking their
I
bluffs or
think
something like that.
a really easy way is to first think about which hand, what is he representing, and do I block that?
Hmm.
Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, like let's say the king seven deuce. Do I have a king with king 10? Yes, I do. Do I have queens? I do not. So I fold at some point, not on the flop, but maybe like at some point down the line. And then does my range look capped? Okay,
Hmm.
like I can't have any better hands. And if my range looks capped, that doesn't mean that my hand wants to call. It means that, oh, I have to be better at constructing my range. So I have to find a hand that goes plays this line and is actually a good call down candidate. And then it's usually never on the river. It's usually pre-flop. Like you messed up pre-flop. Somebody who only three bets jacks and the flop comes 7, 6, 5, you just lose. Okay.
Right.
So that's bad range construction, bad poker. It's not like, but then again, you have to think about is opponent capable of bluffing. Some people are not never bluffing, so it doesn't really matter, right? And
Yeah.
those are I think the easy ways to think about bluff catching.
Yeah, I like that. Chris, any thoughts there?
My takeaway, my try that I loved how Mark was pointing this out is it's easier to bluff catch if we get our opponents to bluff with the weaker part of their range. So and we do that by finding some of these kinds of checks out of position where we some people call it baiting or instigating or whatever you want to call it, but we are prompting them to take those stabs so that our bluff catching is actually easier. It's easier when we have king 10 on the king 7 deuce board to bluff catch when we're doing it from a position of having checked first.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually, I guess the takeaway for me is like finding easier bluff catches. Let's put ourselves in position to find easier bluff catches.
And they're still going to be bluffing with, like, they're not going to be bluffing with just those worst. Like they're still going to have a robust range, right? But you don't get to influence that. Like you don't get to influence what the top of their range does.
They're never going to be bluffing with pocket threes, as Mark points out. If we're doing all the betting. I mean, some players maybe like the real maniacs will find like check raises and stuff with that, but for the most part, it's not going to really be part of their active range.
And honestly, like now you'll have a viewer, he check calls king 10 and the opponent shows sevens. That's just how it's supposed to happen. Like,
yes.
Even if you bet, you're not going to change it, right? You're not going to change the outcome, but you're going to change the outcome when the turn is in 9 and he will realize with pocket threes, oh, I might have to bluff sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. So I think, so I guess I really like that the way that this whole conversation has gone isn't really sort of how to avoid these spots so much as how to make the most out of them, I think. Because we kind of have to invite some bluffs in order for their bluffing range to be wider than it would be otherwise, which means that we do have to kind of wave the white flag in some of these spots. And whether you call it giving up or whether you call it getting into, showdown mode or whatever the word is going to be, it's like we're going to stop driving the action, I guess, and we're going to let them drive the action a little bit with parts of their range that wouldn't continue if we were the aggressors. Still sounds like this is a complicated game, fellas. This is a tough one we've picked.
It really is.
Yeah. And I hope we never crack it. I hope we never solve it. It's too much fun.
Agreed.
Too much fun chatting with you guys about it. All right. Well, this was a really helpful suite of episodes. Is there anything else that we want to leave our listeners with on this subject?
Tune in next week for part 4.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, part four is going to be very short. It's just going to say just play in position with really strong ranges. If you want to play easy poker, just play the nuts and play them in position, and just get dealt aces as often as I do, and not as often as Mark does. And that's a good key.
It will be an unfair game, right?
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I think we'll wrap this one up here then. Lots of thanks to Taylor Moss for submitting a hand that's gotten legs and legs and legs on the RecPoker podcast. Of course, to the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino for all their support. All our fantastic premium members, Chris Jones and Mark Zhang for breaking this down with me in the booth. And all you listeners at home, have a fantastic week. We'll see you next time on the RecPoker podcast. All right, have a good night, everybody.